Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Brandon and I am a crypto influencer across X and TikTok, and I am now moving to YouTube. A move that should have had a long time coming, but it's finally here. You can find me at Let's Go Brando on TikTok and at ABC Mining on X. Namely, talk about crypto in those videos, but YouTube gives a unique opportunity for me to dive a little deeper into the things that are going on in the world of finance. I have a finance degree. I've been circulating around Wall Street professional positions for quite some time. I was a recruiter for sell-side banks, and I am once again a recruiter now for cryptocurrency. So I do believe I have quite the academic and professional background here to talk about these topics. This channel will focus, like I said, on crypto and a variety of topics in the markets. Before we get into that, I think it's important that we kind of backtrack and start somewhere a little bit further than just what's going on in the crypto world right now. Next week, administration's coming into power, and they are very pro-crypto, and they're even debating on using Bitcoin as a reserve asset for the United States. The new administration trying to use Bitcoin as reserve currency opens the door for potentially changing our monetary policy as we speak. And currently, our monetary policy is really run by the Fed. In fact, the Federal Reserve is kind of jerry-rigging almost all international markets. We'll get into that in the next few videos, but I did want to start this entire series and this entire channel really focusing on the Federal Reserve, because that is unfortunately where our system is kind of hanging right now by a thread because and with them. But it's important for us to go through the history of the Federal Reserve, why it even exists, why is it still here, and what other attempts in history have we tried as a nation to mollify our monetary policy issues during economic crises. Have they worked? And for the future crises, what are we going to do about it? So I'll start today, this first episode, with the history of the Federal Reserve coming to be. We will stop at the year 1913 when it was formed. We will talk about the existing Federal Reserve in our next video. If you don't like history, if you find this boring, skip to our next video. That's fine. But I do think it's important that we get across some of the main things that have happened over the 122 years between the founding of the country and, of course, the establishment of the Federal Reserve itself. Okay? So without further ado, let's begin. Way back in 1791, Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, yes, that Hamilton from Broadway, proposed that we have a central bank of the U.S. He was a visionary. He was well ahead of his time. Frankly, Alexander Hamilton should have been born 100 years later during the Victorian era, because that is how far he saw the vision for this nation. He correctly hypothesized that we would brashly take over the continent within the next century, and with it, massive amounts of economic enterprise. Also keep in mind, at the very tail end of the 18th century, they saw the dawn of the age which was to come with some concern. It is very similar to us today looking at the dawn of the age of robotics and AI. Most of us might not really see the peak of that age, our children will, but we can hypothesize pretty well as to what's going to happen, and we can maybe try to do things today that will prevent the worst from happening in the future. And that's where Alexander Hamilton was in the formation of the Constitution in 1791. He wanted to establish a strong federal government, which many opposed and many still do today, and he wanted to establish a strong central bank. Why? Because that way we can have a continent-wide country under one strong economic roof. And he wasn't wrong about that. And his vision is like really correct, really spot on. Like I said, a true visionary of his time. So the first Bank of the United States, as it was called back then, or in a sense, the Federal Reserve, but the first Bank of the United States was established in 1791. And because of the debate of small government, big government, they compromised on it having a 20-year lifespan, which means that in the year 1811, they had the chance to renew it or not to renew it. Well, they didn't. Um, that Jeffersonian era of small government was well into its peak, and they didn't want to expand big government any more than they had to. So it was ended in 1811. Well, what happened after 1811? Well, the War of 1812. And if you don't know about the War of 1812, long story short, it was technically a stalemate between us and the British again. However, we did take the brunt of the hit of that. The U.S. economy and the U.S. land suffered from that war, and there was an economic depression when it ended in 1815, right in time of the ending of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. By the way, the War of 1812 was a theater of the Napoleonic Wars. Many people don't understand that. Technically, the Second World War, but well, that's another video. In the year 1816, they decide that it is time for us to make a second bank. The economy is in shambles from the war, and we do need a centralized entity to hold our nation's treasure. So, then the Second Bank of the United States started in 1816. Then comes along the war hero from said war, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, if you don't know who he is, look at the $20 bill. And in a sentence, he is Americana personified. I mean, he's kind of the first real president who wasn't even under the British crown. He was born in US of A, baby. Kentucky, crazy, bourbon drinking, gun swindler, general, crazy guy. So Andrew Jackson comes into power as president, and the most infamous thing that he did was the Trail of Tears, where he removed hundreds of thousands, probably millions, frankly, of Native Americans off their land in the southeastern United States and the much farther lands out west. In doing so, it opened up a lot of land for the country and settlers to go in. And when they did, it caused a lot of speculation, just like any bubble today, frankly, maybe even AI you can put in category. There was a bubble of land prices, of people just buying empty land for the promise of settling there and building on it within the next generation. That land speculation eventually crashed. And in order to subdue the crash, Andrew Jackson signed a executive order that said that people can no longer pay for land in cash because it was causing a lot of inflation. So what happened was he changed it for gold and silver. He said, no, you can only buy land with gold and silver. That way we'll stop the inflation. Well, everybody took gold and silver out of the banks, and then the banks ran out of money. And it caused what we call today the Panic of 1836. Okay. It was the first depression in United States history. And this was also a time that they call the state bank era. Why? Well, because there was no federal bank. At the same stroke of the pen of eliminating cash for land, Andrew Jackson also shut down the Second Bank of the United States in 1836. So, what began was called the state bank era, where banks still existed, but banks were chartered by individual states, not the nation, not the federal government in DC. So this meant that banks popped up, had different regulation state to state, and banks even printed their own money. Whether it was a banknote or whether it was a state currency, there were different currencies flying all over this country in the early days. And this lasted for 30 years, all the way into 1863. Well, we all know what was happening in the 1860s, and if you don't, it was the Civil War. And with the Civil War beginning, the Union needed to consolidate its power in order to effectively fight and squash the rebellion down south. In doing so, they passed the National Banking Act of 1863 and 1864. And these acts passed three really important things whose silhouette still reverberates today in our current governmental financial system. First of all, they made it necessary for banks to be nationally chartered. Okay, so no longer states. They had to adhere to national regulation, and the federal government will charter and overview banks for organization and because of the depression just a few decades ago. Number two, they started to print real US dollars and enforce US dollars to be used in circulation. The state notes that were being used were taxed by 10% or more. And so naturally, people just started using the cheaper federal dollars. Okay. So that's number two. And number three, they established a system with the Treasury which still mirrors on what we do today. Essentially, the idea was that the government would create bonds, the Treasury would sell bonds, just like today. Banks would buy the bonds and they would keep the bonds in an account at the Treasury. If this sounds familiar, that's because it is. The same thing happens today, except their accounts are held at the Federal Reserve. But nonetheless, a system of where bank collateral is held in government treasuries and banks use that collateral for their funding, that started that economic process. That's a very key turn to what made this country's growth engine really significant, and frankly, for people to trust the currency. Because when banks would buy the treasury bonds from the US government, they would make an account at the treasury with the treasuries, and it's their treasuries, and then they would print US dollars. Individual banks would print US dollars collateralized by the treasury bonds in the treasury itself. Okay? They could collateralize up to 90% of the treasury bonds that they owned. And what's backing my currency? Well, the bonds held in the treasury. And the bonds held into treasury is literally the full faith and credit of the United States. That's where that comes from. Okay? That's where it comes from. The currency back then was backed by treasuries. And what was the US Treasury backed by? Gold. Okay? Gold and silver. So, as an asset, the federal government held gold and silver, but at the same time, the banks issuing currency was backed by the credit, the bonds in the banks. Okay? So this begins this multi-layered, very complex approach to banking, which ushered in the industrial age. And after the Civil War, we had a boom time like no other. Trains, factories, the whole ordeal, the Gilded Age, yada yada. Well, in 1873, a few major things happened. In the 1870s, the world experienced the first global depression during the industrial age. This was the first global depression of the industrial age, okay? How did it start? Well, actually, it started in Europe. In 1871, the German states, which were once the Holy Roman Empire, and then Prussia, and then parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all finally came together in 1871 and became what we consider modern-day Germany. And everybody saw that as an extremely bullish sentiment. There was a lot of speculation in industry and railroads, and it crashed. And Vienna Stock Exchange was the one that really crashed and triggered the event. Vienna, at the time, as it was throughout the 19th century, was one of the, if not the, financial and cultural centers of Europe. Okay, the Vienna Stock Exchange crashed. It trickled throughout the world, not as fast as today, but still pretty fast. It hit the U.S., and even in the U.S., we had rampant railroad speculation. I mean, they just were building railroads everywhere in east of the Mississippi after the Civil War was over, and it led to a bubble, and it popped. After this depression eased, we got into the 1880s. And the 1880s was a boom time. That's when Edison started all his crazy electric and phonograph inventions. But by 1893, the economy was heating up a little too hot. And this was primarily driven by, let's shift the map here to the Pacific Northwest, okay? Washington, Oregon, California, these areas, Nevada, Colorado, these areas, which was once the Wild West and frankly still was the Wild West, slowly turning to a civilized area, was booming. Farming, logging, natural resources like silver were flying off the shelves. It was quite something. It was one of the biggest booms the country ever saw in a localized area. Some towns in Washington, some towns that exist today, like Spokane and Tacoma and Seattle, saw 1,000% gain in populations. It was really incredible, but it crashed. Why did it crash? Well, during this time, with silver being a main economic output of the United States at the moment, and with all of the farming coming out of the Northwest, farming prices actually dropped, right? What happens when there's too much supply, guys? Prices drop. So farmers in the other part of the country were actually losing money because their crops were going down in value while costs never go down, right, guys? Costs never go down. Revenues go down, but costs don't. So they were suffering. And the economy was booming at such a degree that we actually did need more credit. We were getting the credit was tightening. We needed more money in the supply. So they came up with an interesting idea. The Silver Sherman Act, okay, of 1891 said, hey, we're going to do a dual metal system. You can not only redeem your dollars for gold, you can redeem your dollars for silver. 16 silver dollars equal one gold dollar. Not bad, okay. But with all the silver pumping out of the mines, the price of silver started going down. So people owning silver rushed to go buy gold. Well, that caused a bank run. And so now everyone's redeeming dollars for gold, okay? And guess what? The treasury's running out of gold. So it got so bad that they needed a bailout. Yes, a bailout. This is 2008 was not the first time the US government needed a bailout. Who did they turn to? Well, they turned to JP Morgan. No, not the bank guys. The guy, the dude, JP Morgan, who was alive at this time. They turned to him and the Rothschilds in England. The two of them set up a banking syndicate to purchase treasuries from the US government. When they did this, the cash raised by the sale went to the government, and the government used that money to buy gold and restock its coffers, and that ended the panic. Of course, JP Morgan and the Rothschilds made a clean $260 million profit off of this trade in today's money. So it wasn't exactly a selfish enterprise, but never is it. Everything continued just fine until 1907, and this is the last major crises that happened until we realized we needed a central bank. The Panic of 1907 is somewhat modern in a way. Frankly, in one sentence, it was the attempt of a short squeeze. A short squeeze in markets is when there's a lot of people negative on a stock and they either sell it or, most importantly, are short it. And shorting a stock simply means that you borrow the money that you don't have on the promise that you're going to buy it back, hopefully at less value, and you keep the difference. A lot of people were shorting this one copper company, and a few smart, rich entrepreneurs thought that they could corner the market exactly like GameStop, where if they bought a lot of shares at once, it would cause a short covering reversal. A lot of people who were short the stock would need to flip their positions. They would get margin calls by the nature of the trade that would purchase more stock, skyrocket it, and they would make a ridiculous fortune. And yes, back then this was very legal. Well, it didn't work. Long story short, there were other smart people with a lot more money who stopped it from going up, and they continued to short the stock. And to the point where these guys actually got a margin call, the guys who wanted to corner the market, they got a margin call and they got liquidated. And when they got liquidated, all the major banks that they borrowed from got liquidated. And it continued until we had the first real serious, what I would call, banking crisis of credit. So what did we do? Well, who do you think we turned to? JP Morgan! He came in last minute and once again bailed out the country. And at this point, it became pretty clear that the United States needed a lender of last resort. If we're going to continue with this crazy industrial capitalism of booms and busts, which in the aggregate did produce wealth, then we're going to need a lender of last resort every time we mess up. And so after many years of debating, because again, small big government issue, still a topic today, topic back then as it was in 1791, finally in 1913 they passed the Federal Reserve and they created the institution that still exists today. We're going to stop this video here. I hope you enjoyed a little background history of the Fed. And as a closing statement, I will just say that, we see numerous times of different types of assets being used as collateral to back the US dollar, whether it was silver in the times of Hamilton, whether it was US Treasuries in the time of the Civil War, gold in the time of Andrew Jackson, gold in the Gilded Age. We see yet again and again that the hard money used to back the currency actually really didn't last. An issue always surfaced with the hard money that we have been using to collateralize our currency. In fact, the US dollar has been more resilient than any of the currencies, any of the other hard currencies that we try to use to back it itself. So what does that spell for Trump coming in with Bitcoin? Well, I don't know, but history is telling us that it probably won't work out and it probably won't last, which I was surprised to find in my research here, but that does seem to be the case. The way we could make this work, and it's a little bit different than back then, our electronic payments nowadays are so fast and efficient that any time that we would be out of hard money, we could simply buy more. But nonetheless, you still face the risk of a major sell-off in, let's say, Bitcoin, which would really hurt the underlying value of the US dollar, right? Or any other fiat currency that wants to adopt it. So it's going to be a tricky balance between, and probably a 3 or 4 tiered system of where you balance, let's say, treasury bonds with Bitcoin and gold in order to support the US dollar. And frankly, use those hard assets as assets for the US government itself. Okay, I think that would be a smart approach. You can't directly just use Bitcoin to back the dollar. There's not enough Bitcoins to back all the dollars, and there's not enough Satoshis to back all the dollars. Okay, so it's going to be a real careful planning, and if they do want to use Bitcoin as a strategic asset, as a reserve asset, it's going to take years of economists who are smarter than me to figure that out. However, the United States can buy Bitcoin as an asset, not reserve asset, just an asset, to sell when they need it. That is a different story, and that can still happen under Trump. So that's my analysis. Next video, we're going to talk about the modern Federal Reserve, their mission statement, and how they've reacted to crises in the modern era. Thanks for watching, and please follow for more.